The DNA of a growth marketer is really critical. Someone who's curious, someone who is analytical, and someone that thinks from a systems design perspective, which is a little bit different than the typical marketer. Is a conversion the same, or is an activation metric the same? Are we looking at it the same? And if we're not, why? Those are important pieces. By the end of 2025, marketing organizations are going to have cross-disciplinary teams and look very different. You'll start to see...
Welcome to Experimental, the podcast that cuts through the noise to bring you actionable insights in B2C growth, marketing, and data science. I'm your host, Sundar, former head of brand data science at Uber and the mind behind the Experimental newsletter. Join me as I talk with industry leaders who have driven growth at companies like Uber, Spotify, and Netflix. We'll uncover the experiments, failures, and breakthroughs that lead to real results. Now, let's get experimental. Hey, Sunil, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here, Sundar.
Yeah. Well, first off, you've just got such an incredible resume, Uber, Canva, and now Anthropic. And I think it'd be such a great way to just go into the mind of how do you build a growth marketing function, right? Like I want to keep it that high level. And I think we'll touch on a lot of topics. But yeah, tell me a little bit more about what you look at when you're about to join a company. Like, how do you think about, hey, I can really make an impact here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think that, just from some context is I've been at every part of the company. I've been a founder. I've been number one marketer. I've been at companies, with you and others that we've had to scale marketing globally into 40 markets across, 25, 30 channels. So when I think about growth marketing, I think what I would say, and particularly why I'm excited to join Anthropic, is the organizational design has changed. How I think about growth marketing, how I think about the team. So I'll talk about a few of those pieces. So one is, and it might be contrarian, but it used to be that when I was making my growth marketing team, I would look for subject matter experts in particular channels that have done it really well. And so you would hire someone who's really good at SEM or really good at paid social, really good at all these different specific areas that you need, mobile marketing. And one of the things I started to observe, particularly Canva, is particularly when organizations will go through shifts of budget and resourcing and prioritization, there needs to be fluidity of that team. And so if you have an individual who's only been able to accomplish on one channel, making that transition to learn into other channels can be challenging. Mm-hmm. However, the DNA of a growth marketer is really critical. And so I think about it from that. The pieces that I look for when I'm hiring is someone who's curious, someone who is analytical, and someone that thinks from a systems design perspective, which is a little bit different than the typical marketer. And that's the biggest thing I've seen is marketers now have to become technical, particularly as you can talk about AI and we can get deeper. But there's a need to understand how these platforms work. And particularly with my teams that I've built, they have had to really understand the ins and outs of these platforms and talk to the data scientists and the engineers at these platforms of Meta, Google, et cetera. And so the other piece of it that I think is really critical, and then we'll pause, is that it has to be cross-disciplinary. And all the teams that I've built and succeeded at, both at Uber and Canva, were cross-functional and cross-disciplinary. I had product, I had engineering, I had data science and machine learning teams working together with business channel teams. And I think that's really helpful because you have people who understand the domain and the business challenge, and then you have individuals who can technically solve these complex problems. And putting them together makes for a very effective team.
Yeah, so it almost sounds like you've been able to build what I would call almost like marketing as a product in a sense, where you've got all these resources, because that feels really quite rare. Any advice on like how you're able to make that work?
Yeah, that is the thing that I see the challenge, particularly in marketing is not typically a place where technical resources come readily or are considered a priority. And so when I learned from Uber, it was the success of it that I needed to, when I entered Canva, to make the strong relationships with the cross-disciplinary leaders. So I went to the head of product, head of design, data, head of engineering, and I started to build a relationship. So the relationships really matter. It's really about building that trust and understanding of their teams, their motivations, and how they can help support you and the company overall by aligning those goals. The other thing that I did is I brought in case studies. So I brought in team members and I brought in companies like Stitch Fix and Netflix and Uber alums to show what they designed, what they built, what some of those decisions were, to kind of show that this path has been done before and successfully. And, aligning that leadership as well as the founders to say, we need to build a MarTech organization and it has to sit in marketing. It can't sit outside of marketing because you need dedicated resources. I need to be part of the hiring process for those types of roles because it's a little bit different what a product manager and engineering looks like in a marketing organization. And the excitement that I do is, it's through that storytelling that you get, buy-in and resources. And then when you start to deliver, people get excited. And what was really rewarding both at Uber and Canva is that there were now engineers and product managers who wanted to join our team. They're like, this is really cool. You're doing something very interesting. And I think that applying the aspect that marketing has to be much quicker and iterative is something that's like a startup. You're running a startup inside your marketing organization. And it's a little bit different because you have to design a team that's supporting for here and now, for the more immediate, but also allocating resources to things that are going to be built in 6 months. And so you're building a small product team inside your organization. Those are unconventional tactics and require a lot of buy-in and conversations and education with leadership to make that happen.
I can already tell that, I'm going to want to do a follow-up episode with you down the road because there's just so much already to unpack, right? So when you go into a team, there's strategy, there's hiring, there's resourcing. Like, where does your mind start? Like, where are you like almost give me your 30, 60 day, 90 plan. And it doesn't have to be actually 30, 60, 90, but like, what is your framework for thinking through? How do I approach this?
Yeah, I mean, it's super important, particularly joining a new organization. So I think the first thing I really want to do is two things. I want to do a listening tour to understand how other parts of the organization are viewing marketing. There's sometimes a lot of stigma and misunderstanding on what's marketing's role, how it's delivering. Sometimes people feel like, hey, we're not bringing in good customers, but are we aligning on the right metrics? So the first is really understanding how are the perceptions of marketing and how do I make sure that I do the right education and alignment. The second is really making sure I understand the priorities and educating around what are the tactics that are going to help achieve those priorities and goals. I think that's the one thing we've learned is like there's direct influence of channels and an indirect influence of channels. And you have to think about what's your channel strategy for immediate influence and how there's a trailing impact of other things and how to kind of incorporate that over time. So I really want to make sure that we're aligned on those. I also really want to make sure that both product and marketing are speaking the same language in terms of metrics. That's a really critical thing, particularly as we start to look at when the finance team is looking at the contributions of marketing. And so having that alignment to say, is a conversion the same or is an activation metric the same? Are we looking at it the same? And if we're not, why? Those are important pieces. But also the last piece I would want to understand is around, and we can get deeper, but is the data governance and kind of how data sits. I've learned early on that ask all the questions and ask the most basic questions, particularly for younger companies that maybe haven't had the time to go through that journey. Making sure there's compliance and permission of the data, completeness of all the sources of data, and then actionability on that data to be able to make decisions.
Obviously, as a data scientist, I love hearing that, but like maybe give me an example of what led you to feel so strongly about data governance. Like, do you have one where you're like, we didn't do this and this is what happened?
Yeah, I mean, there's been examples where we have identified compliance issues later on, which would impact our ability to reach a certain number of customers. And my feeling is particularly around the restrictions that are happening. I would rather go with the most conservative view, and usually that's the EU, in terms of data compliance and governance, because over time, more markets, more countries will kind of move in that direction. And if you start with that as your most conservative baseline, one, it breeds creativity to find new solutions. But two, from an impact and metrics performance, when you go back to leadership, you're not going to have to go back and say, hey, we were doing something really great, and now we're going to lose 30 or 25% efficiency because of X, Y, Z. So starting from a baseline, particularly when I'm joining a company early, making it very constricted in terms of some of those abilities, it might hurt it today, but I know that I can only go up rather than trying to go really high and then have to cut it. And particularly as you grow, there's higher risk and tension to a drop in metrics, and particularly with investors in the board. And so I don't want to be in that position to have to tell a leadership team that we were doing something really great, and now we're going to lose 25% of it and we have to figure it out, versus like, hey, we're starting at the bottom, but everything we do from here is going to be additional incremental value.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going in, you're doing a bit of a roadshow around marketing. You're obviously exploring data governance. What's next? Where do you start to go? Yep, this is where I want to push a bit.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, it becomes figuring out which are the channels that are going to be able to be activated with the highest alignment to the audience of where we're trying to reach them, the least amount of technical lift, and specifically around transparency and ease of measurement to understand the efficacy of what you're doing. And so every single, company I've engaged with, it's different. And it will be different with Anthropic in terms of kind of the audience. And so I start with that and looking at those channels. I tend to want to focus on the organic channels first because there's compounding effects in terms of what they can do. And there's a virality factor that can happen, particularly with these. And then I start to use particularly more paid channels to test and validate hypotheses, particularly around creative messaging and creative breakthrough. And then once I've figured all those pieces out and I've built out the measurement stack of understanding, how much I can spend in a particular channel, then I start to automate those systems and scale those systems to start to build more feedback mechanisms and loops to increase the amount of content, to increase the amount of efforts. And then the model themselves. So we built it at Uber and we've done Canva. Predictive LTV models are super effective. And so the three big pieces I see, and we built at Uber and also Canva, was you have multimedia mix measurement for your large decisions. You have incrementality testing on channel, using GeoMarket and other lift conversions to kind of get an understanding of that channel. And then you have the value optimization model that, talking to the data scientists is about frequency and consistency. But like, how are you sending a signal to these platforms to create the right behaviors? And so if you build that scaffolding, you're really able to have a really good dial in terms of the ability to spend with efficacy.
Yeah. And do you, without even really looking at the data, do you generally go in with solid hypotheses around where you think the things will be? Or you kind of just go in open-minded saying, you know what, I'm just going to let the data sort of guide me?
So it would first start with testing and also familiarity of what I know. And so there's certain channels like I've seen for particular audiences work really well. I understand how to set up the testing and measurement. And then we kind of can learn into it. But what I do believe in is setting aside a budget, which I work with finance and data to say, this is experimental budget to test new channels, new ad formats. And the goal is to learn and improve efficiency over time and figure out if it's a scalable, repeatable channel or strategy that we can then implement.
Yeah. Okay. And you brought up finance. And I think when we were talking before, one of the things you had brought up is, you always align data and finance teams on actions versus statistical significance. Tell me a little bit more about that relationship with finance and what you build out.
It's super important for finance and data teams to work together because there is a nuance of how a finance will look at budget and how we're going to actually look at decisions from a measurement perspective and our ability to make those decisions. And so at the highest level, I usually work with the finance team to figure out what are the guardrails we're putting into place based on the objectives and priorities? And so there are some markets where they're mature enough, you can grow LTV so you can have higher ROAS thresholds. And there's some markets, I would say, like in India and Vietnam, Philippines, high TAM, but LTV doesn't come readily and requires product localization, content localization. So the question becomes, and again with leadership, is if we want to grow users, these are the places to grow them. And then you're going to have lifecycle and other channels start to do the upsell into LTV. You'll start to build localized pricing and all that. But in the initial, you're only going to get user quality. And so let's optimize for user quality in these markets. In mature markets, like English speaking markets, you should be focusing on figuring out how to grow your LTV of these users. And it's also where you're expanding into either adjacent audiences or adjacent products. Like if you have a prosumer product and you have a teams and enterprise, you can go explore those different avenues in these more mature markets over time.
Yeah, and that's actually the pro and enterprise model is interesting because obviously at Uber, you don't really have as much B2B. Then you go to Canva, quite heavily, I think, B2B. And now you've got this good, healthy mix. How is your evolution just as a marketer sort of gone as you learn more about B2B?
Yeah, it's been super fascinating. And what I've actually seen is that more B2C tactics are being applied and more effectively in the B2B strategy than before. But I would say, and we started to build, is like there's a consumer tech stack and then there's a B2B tech stack. And there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how I think about B2B, particularly around enrichment. So the enrichment of your leads in terms of, particularly if you have a lot of Gmails and you're trying to find an enterprise or vice versa for targeting, there's just a lot of importance in terms of that piece. And we saw that quite a challenge in terms of the sourcing of data, the quality, the accuracy of the data. And particularly as you go into other markets, it becomes even more challenging. The other piece of it that I see is that thought leadership is really important, and that particularly the actual leaders posting and creating content is more valuable than the brand creating content, whereas in consumer it's very different. And so there's just a different channel strategy. Communities matter a lot more, particularly if you're going after these businesses. And so it's a content game, but in a different way. And, I've just been helping a recent company think about, how to kind of scale that. And so thinking about your ICP, designing content. But the other big thing, Sundar, that I see is that because there's multiple decision makers, you probably have 6 or 7 in an enterprise company. You have your procurement, legal, privacy, probably CFO sometimes. What I see and observe is that it's about finding the champion in the organization, but then providing them with the content of all the people that they're going to have to get that buy-in and giving them the context of why it's relevant to them. And this is kind of that translation piece. It's like, how will IT view this? How will procurement view this? How do you give them the right information to provide them so that they can go through those loops? Because typically MSA contracts take about 1 month to even get through red line and legal, right? So at Uber, we were clever where we were like, let's design the MSA, get the sign off and approval on the one that we've designed. And so we're giving it to the partner to say, this has been approved. If you need to add anything on here, we're going to have to redline. So let's try and limit that, right? So those are some of the things that I've seen, is that there's a recognition, particularly being a person that's purchased a lot of B2B SaaS platforms, that you have to consider the fact that there's a process and that multiple people are involved in it. And if you haven't provided that content readily around and provided anticipation around those challenges that you're going to face going through that, then it's just going to take much longer in that sales cycle.
2 follow-up questions. In both Canva and your new role, like, what is your relationship with sales? Like, are you embedded? Are they a part of your team? How does it work?
At Canva, we were trying to partner with them. There was initially kind of a little bit of separation because it wasn't B2B, wasn't the focus of the marketing organization. And then over time, it kind of blended in. I'm going to definitely be proactive in being a partner to sales and kind of helping figure out how we can align on bringing in the right quality of users or strategies. I would say the thing that I have observed is that typically sales teams think that their role is really designed to do a set of tasks. And now that you see AI coming into the mix, there's kind of an existential thing of like, particularly with SDRs, like, what is my role? There's so much that can be done, but it's almost like it's helping to take away all the grunt work so you can focus on really what's really matters, which is the relationship with the client. And so we even observed, like, we just watched the things that they were doing from a manual standpoint. And we're like, well, we come from a world where scaling is critical. So we've seen these problems and we could help design very simple scripts and other things to help you with this. And now with AI, it's even more possible. So I think it's just opening the aperture to say, hey, there's other ways to approach what you're doing, and you spend time on things that are more strategic rather than more manual and tedious.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get into what AI can unlock in a little bit. So that's a really good one to circle back on as well. The second question I wanted to ask was, did you already convince the founders and leaders to post more on LinkedIn? Is that one of your plays going in?
I think that the challenge I see is that it's by the comfort and disposition of leaders. I've told leaders, like, this is what you want to do. Some will gravitate towards it easier than others. It might be that it's the marketing, probably demand gen's team's role is to help create some of that editorial content and then have individual approve it. But the authenticity of coming from the leader, you can see the leaders that are doing it and care about it. They're being much more effective in trying to grow, right? I give an example like Clay. Clay has been fantastic about all team members telling stories of what they're doing and how they're using it. And it's just growing their visibility much faster. And so they're using more B2C tactics than most other organizations.
Okay. The obvious reason you're joining Anthropic is, do you see the value in AI? So let's talk a little bit more about that, right? How have you seen AI being applied in growth marketing, and where do you see its potential?
Yeah, that's been my year-long journey. Now, I've talked to a lot of marketing leaders to understand. I've tried to help them build frameworks around some of the things we discussed around adoption of AI into the organization, from a people, process, and tools perspective. I've gone and built a couple of products and language models, and kind of working with former Uber alum on agentic marketing solutions. I think the thing that I will say is that it's not ready. It's not ready for enterprise yet. And I think that's the challenge, is that what people hope to see and aspire and expect from out of the box is not what they get. And it's still a very pinpoint solution that I'm kind of hearing, is like people are either running a small test or using it from a 1-point basis of, hey, I have an email to write, or hey, we ran a campaign and we got some ideas for the strategy. It's not a system, and it's not designed like that. And I think that the challenge is that you have to design a system. And so who's going to go do that? Who's going to build those connectors? Who's going to do the knowledge training? And so the two pieces I see that are going to be critical is the knowledge base and the training to mimic what the subject matter expert in each of these roles and tasks has to do. And the second would be an evaluation agent to assess the quality of the work that's coming out, to say that, is it meeting the standard? And I think that's some tool I'm sure people are going to start to build and create. But we talked about this, I think, but it's like, you can't really test the efficacy of what you've done today because there's no real trailing effect. It's like, hey, we wrote these. Do we run an A/B test to say that AI generative content versus what we were doing manually was better? It's hard to think about setting those things up. It's not really as readily thought about. And if your models are evolving and you're having 4 or 5 different models, like, how do you evaluate the quality? It takes a lot of training and a lot of practice. And so we haven't yet built the synthetic capability to do those things. And so it's coming, it's getting better. But what I'm really just excited about, and kind of, I saw this when I was at Google, which was when the mobile app ecosystem exploded, is like, there's just a lot of passion and testing and trying everything. And I think this is just a really great time for innovation. We're not going to get the immediate product in the next 2 years. Yeah. But all this learning that's happening is going to be a really impactful outcome in the end. And I get a lot of inbound of different, founders testing out different things around measurement, around focus group, synthetic testing, around automation, channel optimization. They're all like thinking about it, but without the system, they're all just solving a part of it. And so things are starting to get better. I would say in the programmatic content perspective, it's gotten really good. From personalization of content, we've really advanced and evolved. I think from both a measurement and optimization perspective, those are machine learning models, not AI, standalone autonomous efforts, but they'll kind of continue to evolve.
Thinking through these systems, what have you built yourself? What have you found to work for you so far?
The examples I would say is like building programmatic SEO, building out content for your website, landing pages, prototyping those now with Claude. Those are things that are getting much better. The thing that I see is the vernacular is still needed, particularly if you're doing more design and development and you don't have that technical background. And I think that they're going to get accessible over time. But yeah, those are some of the ones that I see around just content generation for different use cases. And so you get 70, 80% of the way there, which is hugely valuable, right? I can write a LinkedIn blog post in 5 minutes now, which used to take me an hour. So,
it's obviously evolved into how you hire and the skill sets you're looking for. Has that changed your thinking? Is that something you're now looking for in this sort of generalist growth marketer, their ability to build AI systems?
Yeah, I think it's just a systems and design thinking perspective, I think is going to be really helpful, because learning a domain knowledge, these are just inputs and outputs. They're levers and algorithms. Just trying to understand the algorithm and figure out how to feed it the right information. And particularly with growth marketing ones is about volume and variance, right? So in that regard, it's just like, how do you scale the volume and variance in a particular channel so that it can get the right calibration for the algorithm? So it requires you to kind of go deeper into the technical nuances of how to make sure it's responding correctly. And so you need to be able to translate that to someone who's an engineer, to someone who's in data, and collaborate with them. So I think that's what I would say is like individuals who have been more cross-disciplinary, individuals who are more freelancers and doing this on a daily basis, constantly testing and playing with a lot of products and are a bit more innovative in new tech adoption. I think they're going to be more successful in the type of teams that I think are going to be important for growth market.
Maybe a bit on just even the type of roles, like you'd brought up, like product with sitting within your team. Like, has that been a challenging role, like that cross-disciplinary thing to find? Like in my experience, like it's quite rare. Is that also in your experience, or have you been able to find, hey, these cross-disciplinary people that are able to understand marketing and product quite easily?
Yeah, I mean, I have found them. It's not that it's not rare. I think it's just more about a willingness to flex to something different. And so I would generally say people who are more familiar in the startup world are going to be more readily attuned to that type of fast-paced working environment. But I would also say is that when you build and scale a system, you need to have someone who's seen large volumes of data and understands scaling infrastructure. So you need a little bit of both. You need some senior people who've seen it to try to avoid some of the pitfalls, but you also need to have a team that's really thinking and iterating quickly. And so startup has that mentality. And I would say that that's where I would have a blend and diversify my team to have a little bit of both.
Okay. Yeah. A little bit of a pivot. Something that you said, which I also tend to agree with, not even tend to, I definitely agree with, is I find, many dashboards, reports to be a waste of time. Tell me a little bit about your philosophy of reporting, dashboarding, monitoring, measurement, that whole part of marketing that still seems to be, I don't even know how to describe it, just seems to be pretty messed up.
Yeah. We can talk about it in two different facets. One is experimentation setup, and then two is the ongoing reporting and dashboard stuff that most companies have to do. So from an experimentation setup, I see a lot of time and energy spent with data teams, particularly that, they want to create very accurate models and have confidence in the way that they've set it up. And so there is kind of that relationship to build and understand how do we kind of create the right guardrails, but don't create such constriction that it makes it impossible for this, experiment to succeed. But then two is that before we run the experiment, there's an agreement on the actions we take. And, it's not like Uber, like sometimes we got the results and then we'd have to go back. We're like, oh, can we increase spend by 25%? Or like, but we've already made the decision. So like, why hadn't we gotten that approval? So, what I really did at Canva is like, before we actually made any sort of experiment, I was like, let's talk to finance. Let's agree with the data team and have the sign off that if it's that sig, we will increase X%. If it's not, then we will do something else. Right. But that decision was already made. So you're not kind of going back. And so there's a high value in doing that upfront work to get that alignment so that you can take action after the experiment rather than waiting to make a decision. And then the second is, we used to sit in a meeting every Friday looking at channels and saying, oh, this one's down and this one's up. What are you going to do about it? Right. And some is an education that like nothing I do today will actually change it for next week. But I think the bigger thing I see is like, there's a lot of why, right? The why is missing a lot from dashboards, and it's really hard to kind of extract that. And so something that I've kind of considered is like, I would rather have a dashboard that tells me how many actions I've been able to take based on the decisions and data that we have, right? Because that's actually at the end of the day, what's most important. It's like, have I been able to have confidence in the decisions that I make from what we're doing? And so, even we used to meet weekly and I would run the dashboard and ask questions, but at the end it became repetitive. And I was like, there's nothing that's going to tell me anything different in a week. And so it's more about identifying like when there is some anomaly that's happening, both in a bad or good way, that we can take advantage of. And so, I think you guys built trend dashboards that showed kind of, something's happening here, something's happening there. So we can make a decision and identifying the opportunities. And so, my utopian experience in dashboard is that you don't actually look at the dashboard, you look at the outcomes of what's coming from it, which is like, hey, we're seeing these markets are starting to trail, something is happening. These are the specific channels that we're seeing impacted for these XYZ reasons. So need to go fix that, right? Or, hey, we're noticing that this particular channel or tactic is working really well. Recommend that we kind of increase spend here, right? So I think that we're not yet there from a machine learning and AI standpoint. I think we'll get there, but I'm seeing companies try to experiment and try to create those next steps. And so over time, like what we built at Uber was an explore exploit model that went out to the whole universe of the bid stream, found all the users, ran really high, elasticity tests of users and then very tight list tests. And it started to find users that looked like good users and then would build a new audience on it. And we were just able to just churn out more and more incrementality over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that was a huge system, very complex infra, took almost a year to build, right? So I think it's going to take time and you have to have the team and the data intelligence to be able to do some of those things. But at this juncture, I think that it's just really important that whatever dashboard you're creating, there is behind it a reason of what action I will take because of it.
Yeah. In both specifically the experiments where you're saying, it's great to align with finance or whoever the other teams are to already know that if the decision is, if the experiment stats say you make a decision, that seems like very logical. And yet I have yet to find many companies do that. Like, what do you think the biggest blocker is? Like, what is it? Is it just like, what is it? What do you think it is that prevents people from doing that?
It's a good question. I would honestly say, and we've talked about the trifecta of data, finance, and the business leader. Like, if there's not a trust in terms of how things are going to be done by either one of those individuals, then there's going to be an imbalance. It's going to be like an uneven three-footed stool. So the relationship matters the most, that I can go to my finance person and say, I'm confident that this decision is going to create value. And as a finance leader, it's going to be a good outcome. As a data person, I'm confident that we have designed this in a way that meets the standards and requirements for what, experimentation should look like, that whatever happens, the accuracy and veracity of the results we can take to make those decisions, right? Depending on the complexity, I'll tell you, there have been examples where one of those wasn't even aligned and it took a long time to kind of get it through. And we had to simplify the experiment to get a result, things like that. So it's not always going to work out, but I think that I've seen that being able to have that investment up front has always yielded much better results and much better action quicker.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good thing for many people that are listening to think about, is just like trust. And you've kind of mentioned now a few times that storytelling and even just internal roadshow, internal selling is so important. And this is, I think, just like a really great, another example.
As a marketing leader, that is what I've seen is the most effective, is you're constantly telling the great stories that are happening. You're continually educating and kind of being in front, keeping a pulse of everything, and also knowing what they're doing and kind of vice versa.
And on that, like, are there playbooks or systems that you found have worked to set up your team for success?
I would say that every company is different, but I would say that it starts with an alignment of a cross-disciplinary team. It starts with an investment framework based on decisions of priorities and goals and risk assessment of return, right? Some companies are willing to grow at the sake of profitability. And what I generally try to do is like, that pendulum is going to swing. I've seen it every single company. You go to user growth, go to revenue growth. So I try to make a balance where I'm never over indexing for the other and designing a model that the inputs can be modified quickly to adjust that for user quality and revenue more readily. And so having a flexible and adaptable system is really critical from that regard.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. There's a lot to unpack here. I wanted to change course a little bit because you've been consulting and advising for the past year. Tell me about your experience, like now going back into full time, like what drove you to that? Like, I would love to go a little bit more into that.
One of the main reasons I went to kind of take a break is I saw that there was needing to be a lot of intentional time to learn. And in a full-time job, it's just the capacity to learn is just not there. And so talking to people, playing with these platforms and solutions, testing them, it takes a lot of time and energy. And now kind of observing what's happened, particularly in all these spaces, I've witnessed that it's really hard to kind of get companies and teams to adopt because of the organizational shifts that have to happen. It's really challenging to build compelling products because of the talent and need of high technical resources in an organization. And so my philosophy is that I'm joining a company where there is a strong talent in terms of that R&D and doing it in a very responsible, thoughtful, and intentional way. And that really makes me bullish on its ability to be able to be successful. I miss the community and the connectivity of people and working together. And so I'm excited to work with a very talented group of people. And then I'm working at a company that is trying to redefine how we transform the way we work and we do tasks. And so the premise of what I will be doing will be a completely innovative way of thinking about growth marketing, which makes me really excited.
Yeah, I imagine given, especially what we've talked about with marketing AI, like you're at one of the companies where dog fooding will just be such an important part of your job, which is, I think, so rare and so cool. So that's got to be exciting for you to just be like, I get to work on the best of these tools as part of my job. What are you most looking forward to in the new role?
There's so much. I think particularly being at a company like Anthropic is just going to be learning. I just love to learn. And so I've already kind of anecdotally heard like there's just so many different roles and people trying to solve for different problems, whether it's societal, environmental, policy, governance, model, implementation, tuning. And then previous to that is that the impact that this product's already had and is having in terms of it powering a lot of the coding platforms and other, AI native tools out there. I'm just excited to see what's going to be possible. So I think that we've just really scratched the surface of, the tool capabilities, and every week someone is coming out with something new, and it's just a very rich innovation, environment right now. And so I'm just really excited for that to continue.
If you were a marketer who's really trying to pick up AI and leverage that in their own day-to-day, where would you start? What would you recommend that they start with?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I would say in there is like, it's creating structure and discipline in how you learn, just like with anything. If you were to learn a new subject, you have to figure out how you have structured time for 3 different things. 1 is learning. 2 is application and going deeper into specific things. So I'll give you an example is like, I'll go solve for a particular area, whether it's like video content generation. So I'll go look at all the tools in this space and see the demos and play with these products and kind of understand it. And then the third is, creating an implementation and measuring your effectiveness to say, I've learned these tools and now I can do XYZ. And that's what I'm actually really reflecting on a lot is okay, well, now I can do prototyping and I can do some basic coding. I can build some sort of, dashboard, which things that would take me like hours to kind of figure out. I'm writing posts in minutes, which took hours, right? So there is this efficiency that I'm seeing both for me and my partner in terms of how we're being more effective with our time and the impact that we can create, which I think is much more important. With my clients today, like I'm able to do so much more impact with less time and energy because I'm being much more strategic and thoughtful about what I'm presenting and how I'm creating it.
Given that you've got such a cool role at such a cool company, are we going to be seeing more writing from you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. And are you still going to be advising and how will you be able to balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I still really enjoy that. And I think that also it's important, particularly for this company and role, is like innovation is happening outside of how people are applying these models into different facets. And what I see, and it's already happening, is you're going to start to see verticalization and niche creations of models that are overlaying proprietary data, proprietary content, and UX experiences. I think that's the other big thing is like people are overlaying a better UX experience for a particular job to be done. And so recognizing how people are starting to use products, where those are happening, are really important, and to pressure test them and say, are they actually something that can be implemented into my teams, and or something that I can start to see more ways for using user applications.
Okay. And last question: what are your big bold predictions for AI? And we'll stick with 2025.
It's a really interesting question because I think that there's two ways. But this is what I would say. I would say that by the end of 2025, marketing organizations are going to have cross-disciplinary teams and look very different. You'll start to see hiring for skills and roles like agentic marketing or AI marketing, growth marketing. Already see it starting to happen. And so that skill set will be really valuable, understanding how to do prompts, understanding how to, use these tools effectively. Just like kind of what I saw at Canva is like Canva became a skill set. And now you're seeing it being applied and, a value to a lot of companies. You're going to see the similar aspect. You saw it on the technical side. Now you're going to see it applied on the non-technical side in sales and marketing.
Cool. Sunil, I'm so glad that I was able to grab some of your time, especially as you go into what's going to be a very exciting role. We've learned so much. I'm so excited, and I can't wait to have you back on after you've started. Yeah. But thank you so much again. Best of luck. This is just really cool to talk to you, and thanks for sharing all of your insights.
Yeah, pleasure.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for tuning into Experimental. If today's insights sparked new ideas or made you feel like a smarter marketer, consider leaving a review on your preferred podcast platform. It really helps support the show. For more in-depth discussions and resources, visit experimental.beehive.com. Until next time, be curious and stay experimental.